Chapter 8. The Green Thumb. The doctor came to on a settee in a pub. After a quick look around, he stood up. Immediately the room swirled, so he half sat, half sank back onto the cushions. He heard footsteps and turned. A dark-haired man had walked around a corner carrying 2 bottles of scotch. "You all right?" he asked casually, as he put the bottles behind the bar. "Of course," the doctor lied. He tried to stand up again, and this time he managed it. He took a few steps around the room, and after a moment, everything stopped spinning. "What were you drinking?" the man asked. "Vodka?" "I never touch alcohol," the doctor said, shaking his head, "except for red wine. Every now and then." He looked around the room. There were several potted plants along each window, each containing a flower. "What's the name of this place?" the doctor asked. "The Green Thumb," the man replied without smiling. "Ask a silly question," the doctor muttered to himself. "Why the flowers?" "If you don't know why," the man said, "you shouldn't be walking around out there." The doctor stared at him until he continued. "1 plant per room, crenoid law, but flowers won't report you to the green police. They don't grass. Pardon the pun," he added humorlessly. "As I said, if you don't know that." "Why'd you help me?" the doctor asked. The man shrugged. "I've seen boozers die on that patch of grass. The plants eat people, you know. You helped a stranger." The man shrugged. "You have to help who you can." A grim look crossed his face. "Regardless of what my ex might say," he muttered to himself. "Could I have some water?" The man nodded. "And salt?" the doctor added. The man looked warily at the doctor, but poured him a glass of water and handed him a shaker of salt from under the bar. The doctor unscrewed the shaker and poured all the salt into the glass. Then he stirred it with his finger. "Thanks," he said, tasting the tip of his finger. "Now, I have to go." The doctor took a step toward the door. "First of all, that's my glass," the man replied. "Second, you won't make it a mile from here." The doctor turned. "Why not?" "You don't know who's safe and who's not," the man replied as he stepped from behind the bar. "I know who to avoid," the doctor said. "The green police?" the man asked. The doctor nodded. The man smiled grimly and shook his head, until suddenly he saw something outside and froze. The doctor turned to follow his gaze. An eccentric with a wide-brimmed hat was outside, holding what appeared to be a cactus in a clay jar. "Rugger," the man muttered. "What?" "That's who you avoid," the man said, pointing toward the window. They watched as the man looked around, then stopped and appeared to listen to his cactus. "Special branch," the man said. "Pun not intended," he added humorlessly. "I need to leave the back way," the doctor said, taking a step forward. "Don't," the man said, blocking his way. "If one's out front, there's another out back. That's how they work." The doctor turned toward the entrance of the pub. The eccentric was coming inside. The doctor turned back and held out a hand. "I'm Dr. John Smith. And you are?" "Andy Kent." They shook hands just before the door of the pub opened. The doctor turned and looked the man in the hat, who was staring at Andy. "A little early to be open, isn't it?" the eccentric asked with a smile that barely suppressed his smugness. "Yeah," Andy replied calmly. "That's why I was asking this gent to leave." "With a drink?" the eccentric asked. "It's just water," the doctor said, then turned to Andy. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Kent," he muttered as he made his way to the door. The eccentric suddenly turned toward him, holding the cactus between them. The doctor stopped. "Dr. John Smith," he began. The eccentric peered deep into the doctor's eyes, then cocked his ear toward the cactus. "Not from around here, are you?" the man finally said. "No, visiting." The doctor began. The eccentric shook his head, then pointed to the ceiling with his eyes. "Not from this world, I think they mean." He looked down at the cactus as he said they. Then I suppose I should put my drink down and come with you," the doctor asked. The eccentric smiled cruelly and nodded. Suddenly the doctor poured his salt water over the cactus. The eccentric screamed in agony, dropped his plant, and collapsed onto the floor. The doctor ran out the doors and turned right. He looked to see if there were any other strange people holding pot plants, but he couldn't see any. But he heard a shout from the back of the pub. The doctor ran through as many alleys as he could, using his sonic screwdriver to confuse the plants. It was some time before he found his way to what used to be the Tower of London. But instead of a castle and ravens, there was only sand and a view of the river. Not far away was a park bench where a dark-haired woman was sitting. The doctor sat beside her. "Hello," he said. "Were you followed?" she asked. "Probably. A lot of green police called to a local pub. Was that you?" The doctor nodded. "I reckon we have 10 minutes at most, Osgood." Osgood nodded. Chapter 9. Verde Estates. Sarah Jane stood at the edge of the tower block, which was surrounded by a tall, ugly concrete wall. The wall appeared to be new, but vines already covered its top and sides. It was just as Gita had described, a prison. Then she watched as an old man walked through the entrance and out onto the pavement. The vines hadn't moved. "Excuse me," she said, walking quickly toward the man. "Why didn't the plants—" But the man didn't look at her. He only waved her away with his hand. Sarah Jane turned toward the entrance and, keeping a steady pace, walked through. After she'd gone 10 paces, she realized she had been holding her breath. She was through, and the plants hadn't moved. She exhaled and breathed deeply, then continued toward the building. So far, so good. There was no directory in the lobby, so she began knocking on doors and asking for Clyde and Rani. Most people just shut their doors in her face, but eventually one old woman directed her to the 4th floor. After a few minutes, Sarah Jane was knocking on the door of flat 419. At first, she heard nothing. Then footsteps. Slowly, the door opened an inch or two. There stood Clyde, older, fatter, and sadder. He looked at Sarah Jane for a moment before he recognized her. When he did, he screamed, stepped backward and tripped over his own feet. "What is it?" came an angry voice. Rani stepped toward the door and saw Sarah Jane. "Hello?" Sarah Jane said. "The doctor brought me—" Clyde quickly stood up, ran toward Sarah Jane and hugged her so tightly that Sarah Jane had trouble catching her breath. "Get her inside!" Rani hissed, trying to keep her voice down. Clyde released Sarah Jane and pulled her inside while Rani closed and locked the door. They hugged Sarah Jane separately, then together, then separately again, and it was several minutes before either could stop crying long enough to speak intelligibly. After a while, Rani wiped her eyes and put the kettle on. "We've been saving a few bags for a special occasion," she said, while Sarah Jane and Clyde sat in the living room. Clyde couldn't stop staring at Sarah Jane, so Sarah Jane stood and walked around. Everything was in disarray, and the place smelled of old socks. But then she thought they had been under house arrest for 5 years while the human race was culled, 1 billion at a time. Rani returned with a tray and 3 cups. After they had had a sip, it tasted stale and awful, but Sarah Jane tried not to let it show. She noticed that Clyde was signaling something to Rani, but Rani was shaking her head. "I saw Gita this morning," Sarah Jane began. That seemed to break the ice. "How is Mum?" Rani asked excitedly. "She's alive and well," Sarah Jane said. "Thank God," Clyde said, sinking back in his chair. They talked about Gita for a moment. Sarah Jane didn't ask about what had happened to Haresh, and neither Rani nor Clyde seemed eager to speak about it. "I'm sorry about being gone so long," she continued. "How is the doctor?" Rani finally asked. "Oh, the usual," Sarah Jane replied, looking away. "What's he look like this time?" Clyde continued. Before Sarah Jane could answer, Rani butted in. "How did you survive? The plants. They surrounded you." Sarah Jane took a sip of her awful tea. "That was the doctor," she said quickly. "I tried to get him to explain it, but it was over my head." Rani's eyes narrowed slightly, so Sarah Jane took another sip of tea. "Do you," Clyde asked, "remember anything?" Sarah Jane shook her head. "Nothing. Not even about Luke and Skye?" Rani asked hesitantly. "Do you know where they are?" Sarah Jane asked. Even though the doctor had told her not to ask, she couldn't stop herself. Clyde and Rani turned toward each other. "Well?" Clyde looked up. "Luke helped them." "The Crenoids," Ronnie added. Sarah Jane jumped out of her chair. The mug fell onto the carpet, spilling tea everywhere. No, she cried. No, I won't have that. Ronnie had jumped up and grabbed Sarah Jane by the arms. Shh, she hissed, looking out the window. Sarah Jane followed her gaze. There were vines near every pane, just enough to listen in. She turned to Ronnie and whispered, Sorry. Clyde got up and fetched a towel to mop up the tea while Sarah Jane and Ronnie talked. Just so you know, Ronnie continued, we don't think he did it willingly. What about Skye? Sarah Jane whispered, wiping a tear away. Ronnie shook her head and shrugged her shoulders. We think the Crenoids had someone on the inside with Unit. We were all scooped up so quickly there wasn't time to organize. But why? Sarah Jane began, then stopped. Why were we kept alive? Ronnie continued. Sarah Jane nodded. That was Luke. I'm sure it was. Maybe he made a deal with them. Sarah Jane pushed Ronnie's hands away. No, she said adamantly. Not that. She stared out the window for a moment, then turned back to see Ronnie brush a tear from her face. I'm sorry, Sarah Jane said, reaching toward Ronnie and hugging her again. Ronnie smiled and hugged back. Then Sarah Jane let go. But you don't know where Skye is? Ronnie shook her head again. We never heard, Clyde added, wiping his hands on a dish towel. How did the Crenoids take over so quickly? We don't know, Ronnie said. Clyde shook his head. Isn't there anything you can tell me? Sarah Jane began. This is about time travel, said Clyde suddenly. Stands to reason, doesn't it? Sarah Jane nodded. That's what the doctor suspects. We've had a lot of time to ask ourselves what would happen if the doctor returned, Ronnie said. It took him long enough, Clyde muttered, sitting on the settee again. Sarah Jane began, brushing away another tear. Then she shook her head. I have to go. But how? Ronnie asked. Now that you're here, you can't leave. The doctor wouldn't let some rhododendron bush stop him, and it won't stop me either. Clyde turned to Ronnie. Get the petrol. Ronnie made for a closet. No, Sarah Jane said. Don't help me. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. We want to come with you, Ronnie said. We've been inside for 5 years, Clyde added. We have to get out. I know, but this part of the plan has to be done quietly, or... Clyde and Ronnie looked at each other, then back at Sarah Jane. All right, they whispered. They hugged again, and then Sarah Jane said, I'll see myself out. In a moment, she was out and down the stairs, wiping the tears from her face.